This is our teaching video for second Sunday of Easter, titled The Wounds of Easter and a Taste of Pentecost. And so those are the two things we want to examine: the wounds on the risen Christ and their significance, and I'm going to present two ideas to you, and also when Jesus gives the disciples the Holy Spirit and breathes on them, I want to call that a taste of Pentecost. If you want to do some preparatory reading, the story that we're going to be focused on is very familiar, but it's from John 20:19 through 31, and it's the story of what's commonly called Doubting Thomas. Thomas and his experience of the resurrected Jesus. Perhaps one of the most famous paintings of this scene comes to us from Caravaggio, and there you see Thomas probing the wound in the side of Christ with a furrowed brow, trying to make sense. What does it mean that Jesus appears to us? But also, what does it mean that Jesus appears to us not with scars, but with open wounds? This is actually a modern take on Caravaggio's masterpiece by a British artist, and you'll notice she does not have the wound of Christ, rather she substituted that with a tattoo that says, "Before the fall comes pride." Now, of course, the wound is significant. I appreciate the take she put on it, but of course the wound means something, and so we have to explore a little bit of what that means. Now, if you recall, Jesus received the wound in the Gospel of John at the hand of a person by tradition who was named Longinus, a Roman centurion. This is a statue of Longinus in St. Peter's Basilica, and you see him holding a long spear. So Jesus was pierced in the side with a spear to see if he was dead or not, to see if his legs needed to be broken by the Roman soldiers. And of course, the spear of Longinus became something that people were interested in across history. There are multiple spears claiming to be the spear. And if you want to kind of go down the Google rabbit hole, look up Holy Lance or Spear of Longinus, and you will find page after page of different theories and different governments who, through the ages, even up to World War II, were hoping to use the military lance for military victory. So Jesus is pierced in the side, and that wound isn't superficial, but rather goes straight to his heart. And so what I want to talk to you about now is how it is that on the second Sunday of Easter, you are invited to touch the heart of Jesus. This is actually a medieval panel, and unlike Caravaggio, where Thomas is just standing there, kind of probing superficially, now here we have Thomas climbing up, almost climbing into the wound of Jesus, really reaching up to touch his heart. And so one thing I want to encourage you is that Jesus appears to the disciples, and he knows them. He doesn't just generally apply the resurrection, but now there's this encounter. Resurrection appearances and encounters, and in those Jesus invites you to touch his heart. So in fact, this will be our theme for several weeks, which is resurrection appearances. Jesus isn't just resurrected and to say, okay, everyone, I'm on vacation. Rather, now, Jesus wants to make the resurrection apparent in everyone's life. And so as a Christian, you have to ask yourself, where does Jesus appear to you? Where does the resurrection unfold for you? And what does it mean to touch the heart of Jesus? What does it mean to reach into that wound, to go through the cross, and to touch his heart? We might say that this is the animating question of the church. How do we touch the heart of Jesus? And what that means is, by touching the heart, we're connected to him so that we love what he loves. We serve the way he serves. And so this is really necessary for the church, not to just say, oh, doubting Thomas, we know that story, but to say, Jesus, you invited Thomas to touch your heart, and now I want to touch your heart, and I want it to change me. Now, this is one of the things you'll notice. Consider the disciples before the resurrection and after. Peter's a perfect example. Before the resurrection, during the ministry, Peter's, he has problems. He's very uncertain of himself. He misses out on a lot. But after the resurrection, even though there's some continuity with that person, he's more confident. He's able to proclaim. The resurrection appearance changes Peter. And sometimes we forget that after Easter, the disciples are changed. And in fact, if you listen to the first reading on Sunday, note the difference of the Peter who preaches and the Peter who appears in many of the Gospels. Now, the second thing I want to say about the wounds of Jesus is, notice there are no scars. Jesus does not appear to the disciples with scar tissue, like, oh yes, that's where he was wounded. No, the wounds remain open. but they do not cause him pain. And what I mean by that is the wounds he carries, but they do not define him or control him. And as a Christian, you need to think about the wounds that you carry. What are the open wounds that you carry that do control? Oftentimes events will happen in the past, but they'll be very present to you because they haven't taken their proper place in your past. You can't erase your life story, but there can be wounds that you carry that do not control you or affect you. And so what wounds do you carry that do control, that do define, that do shape your action? And what I want to invite you to is Easter is a time of healing. Easter is a time of healing. Thomas puts his hands in the wounds of Jesus to believe. We might say that Jesus reaches out his hands to heal. So you should really consider, what is it that keeps you from following Jesus because of your wounds? And these are real hurts. We're not saying, let's pretend just something minor. These are the things that can paralyze a life, but God will set you free. And this is really part of why it's called good news. Easter is a time for healing. And the wounds you carry, you'll never erase them from your flesh. But it can very well be that they don't control you, but rather become kind of a source of belief or healing for others. And we might say that that's our greatest hope. When we go through a difficult time and we find healing there, then when we meet a person who's going through something similar, they say, yes, finally someone understands me. And then there's a certain solidarity and community so that that person can receive God's healing too. Well, that gets us to the second part of the video, which is about a mini-Pentecost. And now I have put a photograph, and somewhat difficult to tell. This is of Mount Zion in Jerusalem. And you'll see down here, it says Last Supper, and if you follow the arrow, this is where they had the Last Supper, called the cenacle, or actually the Latin word is cenaculum, meaning a little room. It's a cute word. The room they met was a little room. And the reason we're bringing this up isn't because we're going to last week, but because the disciples returned to this room again and again. So the disciples are there for the Last Supper. The disciples are there when Jesus comes to meet them. They've now locked themselves in this room, and they will be there on the day of Pentecost. Here's actually a photograph. The reason it's called the upper room is it's one of these rooms in this building here, the upper room. And here now you have the second floor entrance and the balcony going in. Now, of course, you've had several thousand years of history since Jesus was there, so the room has been converted several times. And I don't just mean architecturally. There have been Christians, there have been Muslims, and now you see that the upper room has almost a chapel feel. But the reason this is important is this is the location where so much happens. And we can think about the location of the church. Sometimes we gather in the church and we want to lock the doors. We are afraid or we feel besieged. And Jesus doesn't get angry, rather he comes in. The locks don't keep him out. He comes in and then he speaks. And this encounter with Thomas is one of these moments where the followers of Jesus are afraid. And so soon he'll blow the doors open with Pentecost, but for now he merely comes in to tend the wounds. And then we have what I called in the title a mini-Pentecost. Oops, you got a little picture of the text there from John that we're looking at. So what I want to finish with now is this idea of a mini-Pentecost in the Gospel of John. Now, if you remember, Pentecost is 50 days after Easter. So 40 days after Easter, we have the ascension of Jesus. 50 days after Easter is Pentecost. And if you want to read about Pentecost, you can read about it in Acts 2. And it was a harvest festival, and of course then the Holy Spirit is coming. And really, Pentecost, which we'll get to, is kind of the reversal of the Tower of Babel, where human language separates and human beings are confused. Now the Holy Spirit is gathering, and the Holy Spirit is making one, people of different languages and places. But the reason we call it Holy Pentecost is or Mini-Pentecost, is if you read the text, Jesus says this to the disciples. He says, receive the Holy Spirit, and he breathes on them. And this is an important moment because he breathes on them and then he talks about forgiveness of sin. And so when the Holy Spirit comes to the disciples, you can imagine the creature Adam in the Garden of Eden. When God first animates the creature, God breathes life into him. And now Jesus is coming to those who are afraid. Jesus comes to those whose faith might be said to be dead. and he now breathes life into them. He makes this new creature called the church. And so we might say that this is a foretaste of Pentecost to come. And then Jesus is, if you imagine someone who breathes in air and breathes it out, Jesus is gathering them into himself, and then he's breathing them out. And he's breathing them out with his mission, and his mission is the mission of forgiveness. We might say that this is really what's key for the life of the church, to be agents of forgiveness, to be able to speak in places where there are wounds so that reconciliation is possible. And it's not to pretend. Sometimes people say, oh, I guess you just want me to forgive and forget. No. Forgiveness is hard work, but it's also liberation. So Jesus has this mini-Pentecost, received the Holy Spirit in that upper room that I just showed you some pictures of. And by that, the church becomes alive. And so this can be our call for Easter and beyond, especially when we get to Pentecost. Come, Holy Spirit. Breathe your life into us, Holy Spirit. Let us be sent out, gathered in by you and then sent out to do your works of forgiveness, to be agents of reconciliation. Come to us in our fear. Come to us in our time of darkness. And then breathe us out into the world. And so we might say that this is where Jesus starts to give the church its mission very early on, before even Pentecost happens, which is more spectacular. But now this is something less spectacular, more intimate. And we might say, Jesus, come into your church and unlock the doors, that we might be sent out. Well, that concludes our teaching video for Easter 2. Just to recap, touching the heart of Jesus. Jesus' wound is open with access to his heart. We might say that this is where we start to really live, when we're touching the heart of Jesus. The second thing is really tend to your own wounds. Oftentimes we need to kind of stop and experience that pain. It's not fun, but it will set you free. And so Easter is a time of healing. And really think about that. The wounds don't disappear. Your biography doesn't change. Your history is your history. Rather, what changes is what has power over you. Are you free to choose, or are you kind of shaped by your wounds, and that pain decides for you? And then finally, remember Mini-Pentecost. Sometimes it's not spectacular when the Holy Spirit comes, but the Holy Spirit comes to vivify, to make us alive. That's why we sing that song, Dominus Spiritus Es. The Lord is Spirit, the Spirit breathes life. And so this is our Easter call. Breathe life into us, Holy Spirit. I look forward to being with you on Sunday, and God bless you until then.